auto sequence start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This is Out of Bounds, two guys talking sports and astrology. You're listening to Wayne Moody and Mark Lerner.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our third episode of Out of Bounds, two astrologers talking sports and astrology, Wayne Moody and myself, Mark Lerner. And let's see, what time is it? We're on the eve of Mars exactly going retrograde, making a station. And I've got about 8:40 out in the Pacific Coast, and we're both out on the West Coast of the United States. And just so you know, everybody, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne in a few minutes. We just sent out an email, and so many people, whether you're into astrology in a big way or a small way, a lot of the people have heard me on Coast to Coast, AM, or traveled to the Great Bear website, and we've just put out GPS Astrology, and that's where the first two of our episodes of Out of Bounds are located, basically, and they are also on the YouTube channel, Mark Lerner, Tarot and Astrology, if you want to listen to those. The first one was about an hour and 22 minutes. Second one, 2 hours. Tonight, I think we're going to go for about an hour. But we'll see what happens, because we never know where all this is going to go. But what's most important is that all of us have a Mars in our birth charts, just like Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, the 8 main planets, 4 main asteroids, Ceres, Pallas, Athena, Juno, Vesta, the recently discovered Chiron, if we can say 1977 is recent, the fate, destiny, nodes of the moon. So many planets are being discovered. But we all have a Mars in our charts. This particular retrograde, which happens tomorrow morning, is going to be in the sign Gemini. It's going to last for 76 days. So tomorrow is October 30th. In fact, maybe we'll mention this a little bit. Before going into this recording, I started studying more about Halloween, because there was just a terrible crisis in South Korea that's still ongoing during a festival there. So we may bring that up, maybe not. We'll see what happens. But bless the souls of those who have died and injured as this power of Mars is sort of sweeping through the planet. So in a moment, I just want to read 3 symbols from Dane Rudhyar's An Astrological Mandala. These 3 symbols are where Mars is going to stop at 26 Gemini tomorrow. And then on January 12th, when Mars comes out of the retrograde, January 12th, 2023, it will stop at 9 degrees of Gemini. And in the middle of this whole thing, there's going to be a full moon the night of December 7th in the middle of Sagittarius, where the sun will be, and the moon will be in Gemini, and there'll be a moon-Mars conjunction. And at that point, the sun and Mars will be in opposition, and Mars will be retrograde. So there's symbols there in the middle of Sagittarius and Gemini, 16 to 17 degrees. But the key right now is, in a moment, I want to read the symbology that Dane Rudhyar, from his work in 1973, he reinterpreted symbols from his associate, Dr. Mark Edmund Jones, of each degree of the zodiac. So many of you know about your charts. Many of you know your rising signs, your exact time. Some of you don't. So we want to sort of share about the principles of Mars to the best of our ability. So why don't I just jump in here and do this part of it, and then I've got a bunch of other notes, but I want to make sure that Wayne is able to sort of get the ball rolling with some of the things we want to talk about. So the first symbol here, and this is pretty astounding that Dane Rudhyar had his book come out. It's called An Astrological Mandala, The Cycle of Transformations and Its 360 Symbolic Phases. So many astrologers have worked with this, and on the cover it says, a reinterpretation of the Sabian symbols, presenting them as a contemporary American I Ching. And again, the original work was a psychic, Elsie Wheeler, at a park in San Diego. There's a whole brotherhood, sisterhood, the Sabian symbols, and it goes back to 1924. So 26 of Gemini, and I'm not going to read the whole description. I just want to give what Rudhyar does. He gives a phase number with a symbol, then he gives a keynote and a key word. So 26 Gemini, and this is affecting all of us, wherever Mars hits our chart, whatever house, near any planets, the sun, the moon, this is going to be activating. Frost-colored trees against winter skies, with the keynote, the revelation of archetypal form, an essential rhythm of existence. And then he gives a keyword of essentialization. So again, this is the third sign of the zodiac, the air, communication, learning, writing, literary sign. This is a real powerhouse that gets the ball rolling, where Mars is stopping and energizing this part of the zodiac. Now, on January 12th, after 76 days, Mars is going to slow down and stop to go direct. And by the way, these Mars retrogrades, it's different than Mercury retrograde. So many of you know it happens 3 times a year for the messenger of the gods, and it lasts about 3 weeks. Mars retrogrades are much more infrequent, about every year and a half to 2 years, and they go for 76 to 80 days or so. Now, this is a much longer retrograde, and it's a much different quality, of course, difference between Mars and Mercury. So the last, when we get to January, and this is going to go on for several days, folks, because at these stations, it's not as if Mars is just going to sort of hit this stationary point on January 12th, and that's it. For several days before, Mars won't be moving in early January, a few days after. So get this, and I'm sure Brother Wayne Moody here is going to have something to say about this degree, and he and I both have studied the U.S. chart, so we know this is a real powerhouse. Gemini, 9 degrees, 8 plus of Gemini are 9 degrees, and the symbol, a quiver filled with arrows. The keynote, man's aggressive relationship in natural life as a basis for survival and conquest, and the keynote is conquest. I think time-wise, I'm going to, maybe later I'll talk about the middle degrees of Sag and Gemini. We'll see if we want to do that, because it would bring up a few more degrees. Those are the degrees at the full moon, December 7th, and about a couple hours later, when the Sun and Mars will make a polarity and energize pretty much 16 to 17 Gemini and Sagittarius, if you have this particular book. One last thing, and then please take it away, Wayne. The last thing I want to say here is, traditionally, and we just sent an email out this, many of you know that Mars has always been considered, due to its reddish tint having to do with its astronomy, what's going on that planet in terms of iron. You know this better than I do, Wayne. Iron, oxides, whatever it is, in the atmosphere. There's a reason that it has a red glow to it, so it's always been called the red planet. But if we go back to ancient times, Mars was a god of agriculture, because Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, ruled by Mars, is a time of planting seeds in the northern hemisphere. So seed planting, the idea of agriculture, but it was always considered a god of soldiers and warriors and potentially warfare in different forms. So the ruling energies of Mars are very different, and I shouldn't say they're very different. We've added on energy and emotions and assertion and aggression and our passions and our leadership skills, our pioneering skills. There's so many qualities that astrologers associate with Mars. And particularly our whole work here, Out of Bounds, 2 astrologers talking sports and astrology. So our love has been, at least a key part of our lives, sports, different athletics. And we know that Mars medically or in the body has a lot to do with the muscles of the body. It has to do with the red blood, has to do with different intensity. It has to do with our exercise routines. There's just so many levels of which Mars is a big part of all our lives. So, Brother Wayne, please take it away. Take it wherever you want to go, and we'll go back and forth as we've done before.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. The Mars is very important for me, so I'm going to start with personal.
Yeah.
We saw Tua return to the field with the Miami Dolphins, and we saw him get through a game, win the game, and come out unscathed. But the issue remains with us about the safety of these high-caliber, highly paid, and very, very well-known athletes. Right. Whether it be in football, even soccer has an issue with heading the ball. whether or not to teach children, young children in the small leagues, the girls' leagues, the boys' leagues, to head the ball, the soccer ball, because of the same issue, Today, Mark, was a game in the World Series played today?
Yeah, 5-2. The Astros came back to win Game 2, so they go to Philadelphia on the night of Halloween. Go ahead.
Okay, well, with the Astros, we have Dusty Baker, and he is a Sun Gemini, and his Sabian for his Sun is the Sabian that Mark just read, the 26th degree, because Mark, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, his Sun is at 25 of Gemini, correct?
That I don't know, but
24, 25. And I usually round them off. And it's interesting when you look at the Sabians and you look at the Sabian that falls before and after. But for Dusty Baker, I think it's interesting to note that with Mars on his Sun stationing, he's in the World Series. And this is a man who is very interesting in that his Gemini is under spotlights, literally, because people who look at the relationship of the signs to the body correspond Gemini with the shoulders, the arms, and the hands, amongst other things, and the lungs, the ability to take in the air, and that makes sense. Gemini is an air sign. And when you look at Dusty Baker, you notice he's literally made another career outside of the baseball diamond with his the bands that he has on his arms, and they have this legacy which connects him to all sorts of other famous baseball players. So he has adorned his arms as a manager of a World Series winning team, and he's noted for that. In fact, today when I was looking through the news, I saw lots of articles in magazines and newspapers about his armbands and what they mean and who else is wearing them and all the rest. So he wins Game 2 and they go to Philly, and I grew up in Philly, so I'm a little bit biased here. I like to see the Phillies do well in Philly. And, Mars is going to station tomorrow, and Dusty Baker, with a retrograde station to Mars, virtually standing still in the sky, is going to have to go and try his magic in Philly.
Yeah, well, that's exciting.
There are more personal examples like that, but let me speak to what I know the best. I'm born a Sun Gemini, and I have Mars conjunct my Sun within a degree. And so I have lived a Sun-Mars relationship for almost 72 years now. So my motivation for looking at Mars in any chart is to see what I know best and can speak about. As an athlete, as a person who has had to deal with anger management in relationships, as a person who's a physical culture person, as a person who's had head injuries from falls. I have a long history of experience with Mars. And probably the most important one is the fact that I was born in Illinois at 2:00 p.m. in May. And in San Francisco, if you were in San Francisco and got news of my birth and looked up, you would have seen that the sun was exactly overhead. It was high noon. Those of you, and Mark, you know this, if you've gotten on an airplane and you've looked at the monitor while you're in flight, frequently, unless you're watching a movie, the monitor shows the progress of the plane. It shows the route. It shows the plane flying, especially if you're on an international flight. And I love those monitors because when you look at the monitors, they show the planet and the light and dark shaded area represents the sun and the earth turning underneath the sun.
Right.
So you see the light and shadow creep across the planet. If you're on a very long flight, you literally see day and night happen to whole continents. Well, that's what the astrocartographer does. The astrocartographer is looking at where was it high noon for the sun and for all the other planets as well. And where was the sun rising? Because that is an epic moment in most human beings' lives, especially if you live on the shore, like those people who are on the eastern seacoast, sunrise over the Atlantic. And I'm here, and Mark and I are here on the Pacific, so we're witnessing the sun setting over the Pacific. And those are 3 of the 4 epic moments of angularity for the sun, just to use the sun as an example. Well, right. Mars has the same relationship to the Earth in the moment that you were born. Someplace around the Earth, Mars was rising. Somewhere around the Earth, Mars was overhead at the culmination or high noon. Somewhere it was setting, and somewhere it was at the midnight position. And when you look at your own chart, and you can inquire with Mark about the services that he offers that allows you to see the angularity of your planets, which has been a much discussed topic by astrologers for the decades that Mark and I have been practicing and studying astrology. Michel Gauquelin and his wife, Francois, from France, PhDs, use probability and statistics models to try to figure out whether or not astrology was true, and they use Mars on the angle. So I live exactly under my Sun-Mars line. And under this line, it's on the midheaven. It was at high noon when I was born in Illinois, and in San Francisco and Sacramento. It was since the planets are so close, Mars is exactly over San Francisco. The sun is exactly over Sacramento. I currently live in Sacramento. The degree, the longitude degree and minute of my relocation from my birthplace puts the sun to the minute over my house. And it's in this location that I have written a book about war. Mars is attributed to war. If you get Dr. Lee Lehman's book, where she goes and looks at the ancient correspondences of the planets and how the ancients saw them, you go way back into the time of Ptolemy, and they are connecting Mars with as the red planet. The planet of Mars is when in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have Achilles being that god, that berserker god of war. And so here I have, in a very public way, sun overhead. That means full illumination. That means you're in the public. I've written about war. I've studied war for decades, and I've spoken on war. And now here I am mentioning it to you as Mars comes to a station in Gemini, which is what I am.
Let me just break in for a second, and then I want you to, I know you said earlier to me before we started, and folks, Wayne and I do a lot of this stuff. It's just that we don't record it. And it takes us a sort of while to assimilate all these stories. So just remember where you're at about Mars and other things about nuclear and other stories. But what I want to tell everybody again, in GPS Astrology, the first 2 issues, which can easily be read, you can subscribe. It's at greatbearenterprises.com. And you can see a tab, GPS Astrology. You can subscribe, and you can read each of the 2 issues that has Wayne's 2 stories that are in there, 2 main stories, and there's examples of an astrocartography map, there's charts, and you can start getting familiar, and also his book, War Impulse Pattern, that's in there. You'll see how you can get into that, where you can order it. And it's an amazing tour de force about everything, as Wayne was saying, his kind of how his life, and he can talk more about it in a few minutes. So I wanted everybody to be aware of that. The other thing is that, as Wayne was sharing, there is this whole field that he got into a long time ago, and I believe he has brought it to a kind of finer point of scholarly, amazing research, particularly using America's birth chart from July 4th, 1776. We have a time that our colleague Barry Lyons worked with to kind of create a rectified version of this based on Thomas Jefferson's diaries, the book that Dane Rudger wrote, The Astrology of America's Destiny, going into historical stuff, and then refining all that to get a particular time. So what Wayne has done, because, it's not, sometimes we toot our own horns, but often we need somebody else to sort of objectify it. So I feel that knowing Wayne from Welcome to Planet Earth, which we did in the 80s and 90s, and then continuing our saga and finding out so much more about our backgrounds of places we've worked and lived and other things we never knew from years ago. Now the thing is, with Wayne putting this out there and sharing about it in different parts of the world, so he's kind of walking the talk, and he has always done this with talismans, with minerals, with geology, with history, with the cosmos, as above, so below. So definitely want to tune into the book, GPS Astrology, and each one of us, and this is an important thing as you go forward, Wayne, for what you're doing. Wayne and I are fortunate that we have our birth times. I recommend as best as possible. A lot of you may think, well, I don't know my time. I don't think it's listed. I don't have a birth certificate. So if you have inquiries, do email me. I can explain how you get what's called the long form of your birth certificate. I'm not guaranteeing your time is on there. Many people don't even try this. So there's a short form, there's a long form, but you do wind up contacting what's usually called the Bureau of Vital Statistics birth and death records. It's usually in the capital of each state in America. If you're tuning to this in other parts of the world, you just have to go to kind of a birth and death records and health records, usually in the capital city of where you live. So, it's well worth it to not just say, well, I don't know. I know when I'm born. I know the month, day, and year. I know the place. I wish I knew the time. My mom, my dad, relative thinks it was a morning or not. The reason I'm bringing this up, and Wayne knows this so much like myself, and I've been doing my cosmic calendar for 41 years, where I am scrupulous about using the GPL, a Jet Propulsion Laboratory, when there's an exact alignment every day. So again, Astrology Cosmic Calendar with K, to tune into the Astrology Cosmic Calendar every full moon, every new moon, every alignment of the moon, sun, planets all over the place. I'm giving exact times to the minute AM or PM to make sure everybody can utilize that. Same thing with astro location or moving you from one place to another. Now your chart, like if you're like Wayne, a sun sign Gemini, you'll still be a Gemini no matter where you would relocate yourself. Your moon, wherever it is never going to change its sign. What Wayne is talking about is the houses change, the orientation of where's Mars. Is it rising? Well, if it's rising or above where you're located, if you go a quarter of the planet around, it may wind up moving a quarter of your chart, like from a rising point, maybe it'll go to the midheaven or top of the chart or to the bottom of the chart. As you go around the planet, as you go north and south, your zodiacal positions are going to stay the same, but the orientation changes, which means the impact on what we call the houses, your life story, who you are, self-expression, money, communication, home, creativity as you go around the 12 houses. That's what's so exciting about this. And what Wayne often does is link this to particular places with using the U.S. birth chart, which he has fine-tuned based on particularly our friend Barry Lyons and Dane Rudger and Thomas Jefferson and people like that, so that we know what we're dealing with and we've borne it out. He has, I have, and again, on my website, I'm always doing new moons and full moons with exact charts calculated for Washington, D.C., new moons, full moons, eclipses. So I want you all to know through GPS Astrology, Great Bear, what Wayne is sharing, his book, you have like a whole universe to really work with your chart and sort of be a part of what we're sharing here, whether it's sports, astrology, or whatever your hobbies are, tune in. and hear what Wayne has to say about this. Okay, so back to you and Mars and what's going on.
Thank you, Mark. That was a nice warm-up. What you said about Sly and the Family Stone earlier in 1969,
Right.
I saw them live in 1969.
I want to take you higher. I want to take you higher.
So let me take folks a little higher, a little bit of stretch. Mark's given you an excellent foundation for what I practice. It's a branded version of astro-relocation. Astro-relocation is a very ancient method. It's sophisticated. Not every astrologer uses it in their tool belt, but for those that do, it profoundly expands your understanding of a person's relationship, not just to a local environment, but to the entire globe. It's your macrocosmic self. And so that's why I like to use the tool, because I have moved thousands of miles east and west from where I was born, and the qualities and the tone of my life have changed dramatically. The midheaven angle is where you have a concentration in the public. Your identity, your reputation, the visibility of you, the role that you play, that's a midheaven placement of a planet. If it's rising, it has to do with your individuation, your self-identity, literally the state of your body, your physical appearance. And so when people actually move without the benefit of knowing the astral relocation of their birth moment, they're moving because something is calling them, and they're answering the call. It's like, oh, I got this job in Washington State, and I live in Florida. Well, that's a huge change, and astrologers know that's a huge change. It's going to change all the angles in your life. And the thing that you're used to in your immediate environment, the details of your immediate environment, the everyday things of your immediate environment are going to change dramatically, because your seventh house is going to change, which is relationships, and your relationship to things. And your nadir is going to change, which is your foundation, your home, and your rootedness, and how you nurture yourself, and all of that.
Right.
So what I've done is applied this model from a person to a nation. And Mark and I are both mundane astrologers. And mundane does not mean simple or meaningless or cheap or any of that. It means the study of the horoscopes of nations, kingdoms, empires, powers, and the individuals who lead them. And that extends down to politicians and politics and all the rest. So we really it's been a blizzard of late for Mark and I to get through the day without another shoe dropping with respect to the mundane issues that are occurring in the world. In fact, before we started today's podcast, we were like, oh, there's so much going on, but we'll navigate our way through it and get to what's most important. What I want to point out, and with the support of Mark, I'd like you to interrupt whenever you see an opening, and I will pause to give you some openings, is the map. Once you take your horoscope and it's timed and you create a relocation map, that means you take the sun, the moon, and the 8 planets, and you can take the asteroids too, but I start with the basics, the sun, the moon, and the 8 planets. I include Pluto.
Yeah.
And I chart their lines. Each one of them is going to have 4 angular relationships, and that's 4 times 10 is 40 lines. So the basic astrocartography map that was branded by Jim Lewis in 1977 has 40 lines.
Right.
And this is a great start. Mark and I, we've thrown asteroids in. We have looked at patterns that we see of particular planets, and we've looked at the parans, which are the horizontal lines that run east-west and fill in the little gaps and all the spaces between the 40 lines. But for the United States, what I do is I distill out all the other planets. No Sun, no Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, or Pluto. I just do Mars. I just do the lines for Mars. And that way I have an international map, if you can visualize that monitor on the plane, and you only have the line that shows where the sun is or where the sun is not. So where it's dark, it's midnight, in the center of that bell curve. Where it's light, the leading edge to the left in the west, that's where the sun is headed, or the earth is turning from that direction. And then the opposite side of the bell curve is going to be the rest of the light. So that's just the sun. If you did that for Mars, you would see for the United States that the Mars midheaven, that is where it was at high noon, in the moment that the United States came into existence, was established July 4th, 1776. Mark and I used 4:47 p.m. from Philadelphia. You get Mars on the midheaven running through the heart of the Pacific Ocean. Now you'd say, okay, well, what can a nation do with Mars running through the Pacific Ocean? Well, how about colonize some islands? How about taking over little atolls like Midway? Midway. I mean, it's in the middle. It's a speck in the middle of the ocean, but the United States owns it. In fact, the ownership of Midway is curious. It was decidedly a Gemini issue. Theodore Roosevelt was the president who authorized the laying of a cable over the Pacific Ocean, and they needed a middle station, Midway Island, and so it became an important naval station for the United States because of the cable. Go ahead, Mark.
Interrupt. Yeah, he was a sun sign Scorpio, and I'm not going to get into all the other research I've done, but he was the youngest president to ever become president in 1901 after William McKinley was shot. But what I wanted to say is, because Wayne and I talk about this a whole lot, and he just brought up Midway. So to reinforce what we're talking about, it's really interesting that you brought up Theodore Roosevelt, because he just had a birthday, okay? And he's on, whether we like it or not, his face is on Mount Rushmore. Secondly, he comes from New York, which is where I'm from, New York, and was the police commissioner, led a very, very amazing life, and changed a lot of America's destiny. Here's Wayne talking about the Pacific, where Mars is overhead for the U.S. chart. By the way, our friend Barry Lyons was born with a very strong Mars, and I wanted to bring this up. Hopefully I can say this. The United States I did a podcast called The Part of Fortune, like the real part of fortune, because there's a lot of confusion about some people using one kind or another. To me, and Dane Rudhyar put this on the map in the lunation cycle, the right way to do a part of fortune. I hope this is okay for me to say that you have it up in the top of your chart. This is because you're born in the waning of the moon, and so do I. We are both born in a phase where it's past full moon on the day of our birth. So we both have part of fortunes up, and both in the same area, the ninth house, which has a lot to do with higher learning and philosophy and long-distance journeys and so on. And Wayne has it in Gemini, pretty close to where the planet Uranus was located for the United States. Talk about using science and mapping techniques and being meticulous about all this. And I have a part of fortune in Scorpio. And Scorpio is traditionally ruled by Mars. And I didn't say this in the beginning, Wayne, but I wanted to bring this up because Theodore Roosevelt was also apparently had his chart in the White House. At least there's a rumor, and maybe it's more than that.
It's more than a rumor. Yeah.
Yeah, so he had, apparently, at least what I read years ago, which I thought was astounding, here's this guy. He was younger than John F. Kennedy by a little bit. Kennedy came in when he was 43. Theodore Roosevelt was just shy of becoming 43. because he came into presidency September 14th, 1901. By the way, on a day when Saturn was completely not moving in the sign of Capricorn, Wayne and I had this discussion a couple of weeks ago, and it was like Capricorn, and not just Capricorn, it was like the 9th degree where Saturn was. So when Theodore Roosevelt came into power, the planet of executive authority and of also being conservative, and he's considered the president who preserved or tried to conserve much of the land. Of course, he did other things like all presidents that may have been not so great. But the thing I wanted to say was, here we are, you brought him up, and Midway was the battle that changed the Pacific, and his cousin or distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, whose hero was Theodore Roosevelt, you just brought this up. So Mars line, Theodore Roosevelt, creating a cable, right? Mars is in Gemini now, stopping for 76 days in the sign of communication, which is ruled by Mercury. I mean, this is what Wayne and I do, and this is why it's often we have to sort of take these breaks every day, every other day, every couple of days. We go back and forth with different stories that are not recorded so that we can do this for all of you. So back to you, Wayne. I just wanted to throw a little bit of that in.
Okay, well, let me throw a little spice on what you just said, Mark. And of course, there's, it's just like George Washington cannot tell a lie about the apple tree, about the cherry tree.
Right.
There is this mythology about Theodore Roosevelt. Some of it is quite true, though. He was a weakling in his youth, and he decided through force of will to make himself a strong person. And not just a strong person physically by being a cowboy and big game hunting and a rough rider and all the rest, but all the manly pursuits. He was really a big guy on manly pursuits. I mean, he was one of those kind of people in the room. And that's all Mars on steroids. And so, Mark, I'm going to double check this at some point, but it's either his ascendant, just like his cousin, FDR had the same angle as the U.S. Mars was on his midheaven.
Right.
I believe that for Theodore Roosevelt, and I wrote an article for you, Mark, on presidential travels about Theodore Roosevelt going to Panama, the first president of the United States to leave the United States and travel abroad with his wife to go to the Panama Canal, which is, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, which is marked by yet another one of the U.S. angular Mars lines, but I'll get back to that. But the whole point is Theodore Roosevelt was the embodiment of the masculine ideal for the American man in his day. That's how he promoted himself.
Oh, okay.
And so,
can I break in for 1 second?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, and then just remember where you're at with Theodore Roosevelt, because this is really unbelievably synchronistic, as we always do. So I brought up both Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt on my computer for a second. I have two charts. Theodore Roosevelt was born with Jupiter on the United States Mars. This is true, even if the time is slightly off. He was supposedly born at 7:45 p.m. Mark Edmund Jones, where he did the horoscope, the guide to horoscope interpretation, changing. This was part of like the development of Jim Lewis. It gave like these what was called the Gestalt. For some reason, over the centuries, nobody was looking at the patterns that all the planets were making, like 5 celestial bodies opposite another 5. That's what he called a kind of a split, which often people who have a schizzy personality. And some of us know that from family members and friends, or 9 celestial bodies on one side and 1 on the other, which happened in 1950, the year I was born, with a lot of my friends in the summer. They had Jupiter retrograde. Everything else, the other 9 sun, moon, and planets, were all on the other side. I happen to have a strong Jupiter rising. Well, in Mark Edmund Jones's book, he focuses a lot on Theodore Roosevelt. October 27, 1858, Jupiter's rising on the United States Mars with a Gemini rising. I said at the beginning, I think I said it, but I told you beforehand, Gemini's rising when we started tonight.
Yes,
with Mars
exactly
in that spot, and also the constellation of Orion. Not to get too far, but this is the constellation that just before we started, which Wayne and I do. Suddenly I see in my text line the constellation of Orion. I see Wayne sharing and saying this is in between, I think it was, Sirius and the Pleiades or something. In other words, if you track a line of certain star points, and then I wrote him back saying, all these books have been written that the three main pyramids in Egypt are exactly in this weird diagonal. So what were the ancient Egyptians tuning into with their, Osiris and Isis and Horus and building pyramids, and whether it's UFOs, ETs, whatever it is. Now, one more thing about Theodore Roosevelt, I'll toss back to you. So, look, we can go over his whole chart, but he just had a birthday 2 days ago. I mean, 2 days ago, we weren't planning to bring him up. Okay, now because of Mars on the Midhaven, going back to July 4th, 1776, as we relocate America's chart, as Wayne has done with his book and so many other things. And then suddenly I'm remembering, hey, Wayne is mentioning Midway, and he and I have talked about this before. One of the things, so Franklin Roosevelt, get this, and Franklin Roosevelt, his hero was his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. He was also the Assistant Secretary of State, this is FDR, under Woodrow Wilson, who had succeeded in the years, after Theodore Roosevelt had been president. He created that Bull Moose Party in 1912. This is what opened the door to Woodrow Wilson. Well, in that time period, of course, the difference is that Theodore Roosevelt was in the Republican Party and FDR was, as we now call, a New Deal Democrat and governor of New York. Now, the thing is, Franklin Roosevelt's chart is also very accurate, and he has Mars and Gemini at the Midhaven. And the chart I'm looking at shows 22 Gemini at the Midhaven, which is also his cousin's Jupiter, which is the U.S. Mars. So I'm tossing it back to you. This is what Wayne and I do. It's like presidents, Mars, astrocartography, geography, longitude, latitudes. It's all sort of happening. And the last thing I would say on this before I throw it back, and because you hear me, Wayne, share this all the time, why is this happening? As above, so below. This is the ancient aphorism, goes back to Hermes Trismegistus of ancient Egypt. And by the way, the other thing is 100%, I believe that Mars rules two signs and will always rule Aries and Scorpio. Pluto has a lot to do with Scorpio, but it takes 246 years for Pluto to orbit the entire zodiac. And every 2 years, Mars will go around your chart and Wayne's chart, my chart, and any human being, any business, and so on, going through every house. So when people out there say, "Oh, Pluto rules Scorpio, the underworld, mysteries, and so on," yeah, it has an affiliation. It's meaningful, but it doesn't rule it on a day-to-day level. And astrology that Wayne and I do, and so many other astrologers, are based on facts, specific dates, times, places.
Perfect segue for Mark.
Yeah, it isn't airy-fairy. It's not looking at a crystal ball. We're dealing with it scientifically as we can do. Go ahead.
Okay, and following up on Mark's last word, facts. I was trained as a geologist, and never in my wildest dream did I see myself as an astrologer. But for a geologist, I'm literally in caves, in the ground, with rocks in my pockets, dealing with the tangible and the solid. Now, that's limited. However, with the astrology, I've created a weave of the astrological view and perspective, especially the as above, so below, and I've been able to shoehorn my love of geology into that. And so I call myself Earth Harvest.
Right.
I like, as a human being, trying to navigate this Earth and use my astrology, my horoscope, as a tool. The map is not the territory. In other words, the person is well beyond this map of reality that we use. But this horoscope is so profound. Mark and I have been in it for decades, between the two of us closing in on a century. And we discover new things every day.
Right. Every day.
So for me to look at the U.S. Mars line, which runs around 169 degrees west longitude through the Pacific Ocean, and embraces these specks of Earth that happen to be in the midst of this ocean, close to Midway to the west of the line, close to American Samoa, and hardly anything else. Oh, Johnson Atoll, and Johnson Atoll is where the United States shipped all of its biological and germ warfare canisters to store when the countries agreed to get rid of those items. So it's just very curious as to what's exactly under that line. But I'd like to read the cablegram that was sent to Teddy Roosevelt on July the 5th, 1903, from Midway Island.
Yeah.
The president was in Oyster Bay, New York, and it was 12:25 a.m., and he received the following: "Greetings from lonely Midway to our president and citizens on this glorious occasion."
Mm-hmm.
And so we get the date and we get the time. We get the astrological facts. We have the map. We know the coordinates and the location. Oh, this is Christmas for the astrologer to get that kind of information. And then we go to town with the symbolism. And here we are looking at Mars. And we're looking at that Mars for the nation. We're able to tie in two of its most prominent presidents. And one more thing. FDR, after Pearl Harbor, the United States was on the ropes, trying to figure out how to rebuild their Navy, most of those battleships that were destroyed in Pearl Harbor, but the aircraft carriers had gotten out. They were not there, to the chagrin of the Japanese Imperial Fleet, because they had hoped to catch them all there and to prevent the United States from having any agency for engaging in war and interrupting them, so that they would only have a one-front war.
Yeah.
And what happened was the United States cryptologists broke the Japanese code, and they pre-positioned 3 aircraft carriers at a place called Point Luck in the middle of the Pacific, 300 miles northeast of Midway Island. And it was an ambush because they knew in advance that the Japanese fleet was headed there, and they were going to ambush them with dive bombers. And as it turned out, this battle happened between June the 3rd and June the 7th of 1942. And for those astrologers out there, you have your ephemeris. You can go and look it up. For those of you who are not astrologers, you can Google ephemeris June 1942, and it will give you the same. Well, it will give you a version of what Mark and I have in our sophisticated ephemeris.
Well,
now,
I got to throw something
go
out
ahead.
in a minute.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Well, because I'm sitting at my computer, I just took the U.S. chart. This is astrology in action, folks. Took the U.S. chart and I relocated it to Pearl Harbor, because what I want, I've done this before. Now, Wayne has been sharing about certain islands, particularly because earlier today, and he shared this with me, if I can personalize it. I got into astrology through dreams. I was in the solar system before I ever got into astrology. I was sort of into astronomy. I'm still into astronomy big time. So is Wayne. But he's bringing everything down to the Earth globe, latitudes, longitudes, as it says, params, the history of astrocartography through Jim Lewis and other people, locality. So as he was sharing about these islands, and I know earlier today he and I have talked about this because both of us, and I did this nuclear research when Welcome Planet Earth first started in 1982. So I was a spring chicken. I was 32 years old. I was back in Amherst. This was Welcome Planet Earth before it became a newspaper and a magazine that Wayne and I were part of with all these mundane Earth astrologers. It was a stapled together newsletter. I got into everything about atomic energy and nuclear energy. And I did all this research. Well, this morning, Wayne was, I was into sports at one point, then he was into nuclear stuff. Then later he was talking about Dusty Baker, and I'm throwing things back on nuclear. That's sort of how everything is going. At any rate, get this. Okay, so the actual U.S. chart, if you relocate it to Pearl Harbor, as Wayne was sharing, 2+ of Libra is rising, 2+ of Aries is setting, 2+ of Cancer. It's pretty much like almost what we call an equal house chart. Okay, it's kind of fascinating. So 2+ degrees of the cardinal signs are on the horizon. Now, when you look at the chart, you're going to see Venus near the top of the U.S. chart, calculated Pearl Harbor, 3+ of Cancer, almost exactly at the top of the chart. Well, Venus is a planet, of love, of heart, and so on. But midpoints, and get this, midway and midpoints, jumping from Midway Island, which turned the tide in the Pacific, and you were talking about for other reasons, ownership by the U.S., the Mars line, and so on. Now, in the midpoint structure, and I studied this a while back, midpoints have to do with the middle points. Wayne and I were talking about this, and recently I, threw some of these in your own chart, talked about my own. I've studied midpoints for 40 or 50 years. They're hidden in each chart. They're kind of like the underworld of the chart. They're simply the middle points between Sun and Moon, Mercury and Venus, whatever the two planetary points are, or even the Sun and an angle, if you know your birth time. And there's dozens of these natally, by transit and progressions. In the U.S. chart, this is just what I want to say. Why were the Japanese on December 7, 1941, on a Sunday morning, there's a whole history there. But the U.S. chart shows Venus right at the top, okay, within a degree. So that is, if something negative is going to happen, we're going to lose several thousand soldiers, naval, Marine, this whole horrendous thing that causes FDR, to say this is a day that will live in infamy, and we start a war against the Japanese, then the Germans declare war on us, and here we are going into World War II. Uranus and Pluto, two distant planets, are within 1 degree. Their middle point of where they're both energizing is the 7th house cusp, which is either allies or enemies. That's Uranus and Pluto, sitting within 1 degree. You don't see it if you look at the chart. They're midpoints below. As we go around, I'll make this real fast. On the ascendant, within 1 degree, is the Saturn-Neptune midpoint. Now, I'm not even giving you the degrees in the U.S. chart. I'm just telling you the middle point of mighty Saturn and Neptune for the U.S. at Pearl Harbor is somehow Saturn and Neptune are on the ascendant. Uranus and Pluto are on the descendant. That's what we call the horizon line going east and west. But we're not done. And this is probably new to you, Wayne, because it's new to me, because I'm not normally doing this. While Venus is at the top of the U.S. chart in Pearl Harbor, and the whole issue of how we got Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, and it is a planet of peace, the U.S. midpoint of Sun and Mars, which you were just talking about in particular, you mentioned the Gokul about Mars, you mentioned about, like, if you're in an aircraft, you're talking about how you could do it. Literally, the Sun-Mars midpoint is precisely at the midhaven or the vertical line of Pearl Harbor. Now, there's one other point here, which would be the Capricorn point, and I'm going to look here and see if anything's over there. It may not be. No. Okay. So what we've got here is Saturn and Neptune are exactly hitting the rising point. Uranus and Pluto are hitting the setting point, and the Sun and Mars are hitting the vertical line, which is above and below, and activating our Venus. That means 4 celestial bodies are impacting us and Hawaii. And most people would say, what is the thing that you know about Hawaii? Okay, if you ask that question, right, somebody just walks up to an older person and says, tell us something about Hawaii, not whether you traveled there, lays, or it's beautiful, or, yeah, I went on a plane there. They're going to say, the Japanese surprise attack, December 7, 1941, led us into World War II. And here it is. It's in the astrology chart. Back to you.
And there it is. Not on the map.
Right. Your book.
Right.
Mars not on the map. Yeah, go ahead.
This is the fuel that just keeps on working, isn't it, Mark? The fact that this narrative, and that's what language does, and that's what the astrology does, the art of reading the symbols. And right. Mark has polished that to a fine ne'er-do-well. And I just go, just give me the facts, and I've got my specs on, my head down, and looking for the stone in the ground. But sometimes you have to be able to share it and put it into a narrative form that flows, and it's simple, and it can be understood in pieces. And so here we are. We're still talking about that same place, that same location, the Pacific Ocean, and why is the United States there? Was it the logical westward whole manifest destiny thing? I don't know, but we certainly did continue it out over the oceans to Alaska and to Hawaii. So back to the Battle of Midway, which fascinates me because it was considered to be. It was considered to be just the odds against it being successful were totally against the American crippled fleet with 2 aircraft carriers, one of them cobbled together after the Battle of the Coral Sea, staging and trying to attack the Japanese fleet with 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of veteran pilots who had been fighting in China and fighting in the Manchuria, and many battleships, and defeat them. But the country did, and it was a rallying point. And some historians list it as the greatest naval battle in U.S. history. Well, that greatest naval battle in U.S. history had 5 planets in Gemini. Early in that year, when Doolittle's raid occurred, and I believe it was in April of 1942, Mars had made its return. And so during the Doolittle raid, still in the Pacific, but 600 miles to the east of Japan, headed towards Japan, they launched these B-29 bombers off of an aircraft carrier. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And Doolittle did minor damage to Tokyo, but what he did, and it was a preview to Midway, was he previewed that the United States might would be in the air. Mars in Gemini. Uranus in Gemini in the U.S. chart. Uranus is the innovation, the industrial age, the age of machines, the ability of flight. The Wright brothers. It connects to all of those narratives, and that's the art part of the astrology. It's like we never know where it's going to go, but it will connect where it needs to connect because everything is connected like that, and some more than others. We have 2 presidents who are definitely connected to war in the American psyche. They participated in war. They managed wars, and they were victorious in wars. And without, going too far afield, we had George Herbert Walker Bush and his tremendous success in the first Gulf War. And he was another one of these people who had his sun sign in Gemini conjuncting the U.S. Mars. Right. And so I want to move on quickly to the other lines, and then we can take it somewhere else. But I thought I would nail this down because it's so important, and it's such an important reveal for people who have the time in their chart and want to have this done. If you travel abroad, if you purchase items, import goods, if you have a foreign car, if you have computer technology that's made, or a cell phone that's made in China and the computer that's made in Taiwan or in South Korea, this will be meaningful for you to see why you bring these elements and attract these elements to you in your life on the stage where you are. You don't necessarily have to go to the mountain. Sometimes you can bring the mountain to you, and that's what I call Earth Harvest. I also call these things talisman because we all have a talismanic relationship with the whole of the earth. And for us to have some insights into, even if we don't travel, if you've never left the community that you were born in, but you have dreamt of places, if you have read the books that take you places, if you have read Hemingway's books, if you've read Pearl and Buck and then you connect to these different places because these ideas come into your life. Not just.
Well, let me just ask this question. So, are you going to give the other Mars lines?
Yes.
Because for this, yeah. Okay. Why don't you give, if you can? The reason I'm bringing this up is I wanted to bring in a moment. I know you know what the lines are, what you're about to say. I want to bring in. Here's what I want to bring in because we're so much worried about Ukraine, about Putin, about is the former president, and so on. And I wanted to bring up some personal stuff in a moment about the fact that Vladimir Putin has a moon in Gemini. So does Obama. Part of the reason I think we never went to war was that there was something going on there, a sort of general respect. For a while there were a lot of mistakes, of course, Crimea and so on. But the fact that two people who are world leaders both have a Gemini moon, and stuff about the former president Donald Trump being a sun sign Gemini, and his chart is very connected to Putin, which we've studied so many other people. So I wanted to bring up that and John F. Kennedy also with his sun in Gemini, just to keep the whole Gemini thing going. But why don't you give those other three spots, which I believe what he's going to do would be where Mars is rising, setting, and at the IC, right?
Okay. Well,
approximately.
Here's a big recent hit to the Mars midheaven line that runs down through the heart of the Pacific. That Mars line is it's very close to the island of America Samoa.
Right.
And earlier in the week, on Monday, Mark and I read the following news out of the Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court has decided that American Samoans, in their quest to gain citizenship, they would not hear their case.
Right.
And so here is, again, the last GPS we discussed Samoan people and American Samoans in America and how there's so many of them, for their population, there's such a high percentage of them in professional sports, particularly football, and in the military, the U.S. military, career people in the military. And so here, they're not good enough to be American citizens, but they're not going to be able to get even a hearing with the United States Supreme Court. Right. Now let me move you to the other lines. Very quickly, just paint the image in your mind. Again, these are angular lines, and they're dispersed around the world. When we say a line, we mean a series of dots that if you connect them together, they will form a line. So all of the locations that are under that line have a particular thing in common, and that would be that the planet would be on the angle. So in the news recently was Haiti, and Haiti was appealing to the United States and to the United Nations to send troops because the criminals have taken over their country. The United States Mars line runs through, not near, but through Haiti. And the Dominican Republic.
That's the Mars setting line, right?
That's the Mars setting line. And the United States setting, or the seventh house in a mundane chart, would be open enemies. And so here in the United States, in the 20th century in particular, on many occasions, has occupied these countries.
But let me just throw one other thing in, because they were asking the UN to possibly send troops. And one of the things that troops sometimes do, even though they're on offense, is supply through the Defense Department food and things like that if that's the positive use of that by flying in planes, like the bigger planes, to supply. I mean, so it could work out positively, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
And so when you pursue this line, a descendant line and an ascending line are going to be diagonal lines. Just like when you look at the monitor on a plane flight, there are curved lines. The vertical.
Let me just wait. Let me just throw this in. In GPS astrology, where we give an example on one of the pages before Wayne's articles, we give a map, and I explain yellow-looking sort of curved lines on the map, which is basically, when people used to think the Earth was flat, I laugh about it, but what we have with these world astrocartography maps, or any of these maps, usually they appear as a rectangle, and the lines that are rising and setting are often, just to colorize this, are yellow. And when you see, say, Mars up or down, above or below, there'll be a Mars symbol at the top of the map. That will mean Mars was at the midheaven or at, the 10th house cusp. And if you see the red line going vertically again, but if you see the Mars symbol at the bottom, that's how to read the stuff. So I just wanted people to know that. Go ahead.
Excellent. And so just again, I'm going to say this quickly, and then I'm going to move on. The United States has a long history with Colombia. The United States has a long history with Panama. Well, the Mars line for the United States runs very close to the locks of the Panama Canal. And it runs through, again, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It runs through, all of that international drug dealers, the Cali cartel and all of that. Well, that's literally within miles of the U.S. Mars descendant line. And the United States considers them enemies to the national security.
Well, I got to throw one more thing on a personal level, because this is so beautiful what you're doing. I mean, beautiful in terms of design. John McCain was born in the Panama Canal Zone in the middle of the Great Depression.
And one of the great warriors.
And exactly, 5 years in a North Vietnamese prison camp. And the former president, whether you like him or not, disparaged him and said, just like he went after Obama for supposedly not being born in the United States, that whole thing, which was, as we know, a complete false reality. He also tried to disparage John McCain at one point, saying, you can't run for president, or you shouldn't have run. You shouldn't even be a senator because you weren't born in the United States. And he kept doing that kind of thing. And Wayne has just pointed out, this is where the contentiousness is between the Panama Canal. The other thing is, isn't Jamaica fairly close to Haiti, right? And that Mars line? Yes?
Okay. Within Jim Lewis's system, his orb, in other words, east and west of the lines, how far do you have to go in order to feel the effect? It's well within. Jamaica is well within. Cuba, eastern Cuba, is well within the orb of the U.S. Mars descending line. Yes.
Okay, the reason I'm bringing this up is
Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay.
We have the first woman vice president ever. Her father was from Jamaica. This is not often talked about. She's considered, according to the press, the first Asian American leader. They don't mention Jamaica. And there's so much attack going on to Kamala Harris because we've never had a woman president. This gets back to the moon, Pallas Athena, and this new planet called Aquarius, all in 1 degree, at 27 degrees Aquarius, and our country is a Cancerian country, which is a feminine sign. I'm just trying to ad-lib here. As Wayne is sharing about Mars in its positive and negative qualities, and what he's doing is basically communicating to all of you, and myself as well, because we did this back and forth, is a country has personality. In that stuff with the Destiny of the Nations, one of the Lucis Trust books, 24 books, the Tibetan master DK, who inspired Alice Bailey, that's the whole esoteric thing. You go to GPS Astrology, my website, for more on all that. There's, I think it's page 40 or something, the Tibetan master, this teacher to Alice Bailey, says countries are feminine or masculine. And he describes that the United States, Brazil, for instance, even Russia, there's this whole thing, Mother Russia, We don't call it Father Russia, regardless of what Vladimir Putin wants to say, or Vladimir Lenin, or anybody else. It's considered a feminine country. And we can go into ballet, we can go into poetry, right? We can go into ice skating. We can do so many different things of the soul of Russia, which is getting obscured. Countries like Brazil, they're having an election tomorrow to see whether it's going to be right-wing or left-wing. Another big geopolitical thing. So the point is, Brazil is a feminine country. The United States is a feminine country. I'm just giving examples because we're all dealing with our own male, female, right? Mars, Venus, the two planets that surround the Earth, and countries. And this could change in, several hundred years or another time. A country might shift from feminine to masculine. By the way, Germany and England and Italy and India are considered masculine. Okay. Now, when I say masculine or feminine, again, broad understanding. But it's fascinating that we want to understand this, and it's just an extra way for us all to understand, what is the nature, what is the personality, the fact of what is America, these lines of energy. What was the point of the country coming together? All these different ethnic groups, nationalities, ideas, a melting pot, which is still up for grabs. So whether we're going to be able to have that. Mars is a planet that can either be leadership and strength, or the opposite, war and volatility. Go ahead to the other lines, please.
Okay, and so let me continue up from Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Close to Haiti is also Puerto Rico, and it's important. It's interesting to note that the deal that Churchill made with FDR to get the United States into the war early, in ways that didn't upset the pacifists in the United States, because FDR could not commit to ground forces or declaring war on Germany until after the Battle of Midway, after the attack of Pearl Harbor. But the United States made a deal with the UK for its for bases, naval bases in their holdings. And where did the UK have holdings? Pretty much everywhere in the world, in places like Puerto Rico and the Caribbean islands. And the United States was able to say, okay, well, we'll send you battleships and we'll send you tanks and we'll send you food and we'll send you all this other stuff in the Lend-Lease program in support of the phony war. It was during the phony war period. One more thing. The Atlantic convoys went up the U.S. Mars descendant line, and they went up past Iceland, and the United States established a naval base in Iceland. The Mars line goes right through southern Iceland. And then it continues and goes to northern Norway and the upper part of the Scandinavian peninsula.
Let's clarify the Iceland thing. What's the line there again?
Oh, the United States Mars descendant line, the same one that goes through Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the same one that goes through the Panama Canal, also goes through Iceland because of the curve.
That's Reykjavik, and that brings up Gorbachev and Reagan, correct?
Yes,
and also, didn't Donald Trump and Putin, did they have a meeting there or not? Something happened in the last couple of years, but at any rate, we know that Gorbachev and Reagan had a major meeting there, so that would be on the Mars. Go ahead.
Okay, now I'm going to switch to another line. I'm going to switch to the midnight Mars position, which means, as you're looking at the flight monitor, the middle of the black bell curve, if you made a line going and bisecting that would be the midnight location. So Mars in the midnight location means it's affecting the fourth house, the inner world, the emotional world, the foundation, all the things that support a country in a mundane chart. It would be those literally the farmers, the industrial base, the stability of the country, down to the kinds of housing that you would find in these places. Well, the U.S. Mars line goes from Oslo, Norway. It goes almost virtually through Oslo, Norway, and it runs down through Denmark, through Germany, goes through Tunisia, and then it goes to Nigeria. So north and south, it creates a line that goes, and how does World War II fit in? The United States invaded North Africa. They fought moving east to hook up with Bernard Montgomery, who was the British war leader, commander. They fought a battle against Rommel and his desert rats in Tunisia. They defeated the Germans and pushed them off of the North African continent in Tunisia, and then they invaded Sicily. All of this is under the United States Mars Midnight Line. It runs right through Tunis, which is the capital of Tunisia. And then it continues up north through Italy. There was that entire Italian campaign. And then it runs through the heart of Germany. What's important for the United States is the fact that it goes through the heart of Germany. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, this is what Wayne and do, folks. This is like an eye-opening slice of life. I'm laughing. This is so atypical of what we do almost every day until Wayne says, I need to take a break. I need to smell the flowers. I need to take a walk. And then says to me, why don't you go out and take a look at the full moon? Okay, so get this. You just blew my mind because I'm not in, folks, I just want you to know I'm not on this kind of regimented, very clear energy. And Wayne has a lot more military and other kinds of experience and wonderful things, not so wonderful also, but, his life pattern has allowed him to understand places and so on. So when you said Oslo, I suddenly thought of this and all these places. Okay, remember this morning or just recently, we were talking about different of these great scientists and physicists having to do with the atom, and Wayne knows that I did this whole research ages ago on the nuclear axis, which is 7 to 11 Gemini and Sagittarius. And at any rate, that story is still in Earth Aquarius News in the news section at greatbearenterprises.com. You can want to read about, what I did there and so on. The Nobel Prize, okay, because this all came out of the guy who invented dynamite, right? Alfred Nobel. So the thing is, right there, okay, the U.S. Mars line underneath, established, first awarded December 10 in the sign of Sagittarius. One of the things I wanted to bring up is we're going to have the Sun-Mars retrograde opposition at the anniversary of Pearl Harbor to get back to what we were doing before. And I mentioned that earlier. That's the Sun-Mars retrograde opposition, kind of the height, almost like what we call the full moon, but it's not going to be a full moon. It's a full Mars. When the Sun and Mars go opposite each other, Mars is always retrograde. So in this case, the Sun will be in Sagittarius, Mars will be, as we know, in Gemini. And when they form an opposition, that's basically their version of the monthly full moon. It just only happens every a year and a half. And this one is taking place miraculously, or, hopefully everything will be okay in Hawaii. They do have volcanic stuff. I'm not expecting any incursion from any forces anywhere, but you never know. And then, of course, Wayne and I love the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original one in 1951, when suddenly a flying saucer, beautifully in this movie, lands on the White House lawn, and we have this amazing story, that was then redone a couple of years ago. I just watched it the other night with Keanu Reeves. So, this whole idea of intervention, we worry about the Putins of the world in America. Wayne and I have studied these different people. Now, you just mentioned again Denmark, and a couple of hours ago, I suddenly was tuning into Niels Bohr, the great scientist, who helped us understand that the structure of the atom has a lot to do with protons and electrons moving around. It's kind of similar to planets moving around the sun. And I'm pretty sure I remember, because I studied him, that he had a dream that helped him to understand this. And he was a philosopher as well. So he was born in Denmark, okay, along this Mars IC, or Mars at the bottom of the U.S. chart, which gives us, unfortunately, weapons that can destroy the Earth. So again, that's Denmark, and that's where also Adolf Hitler was invading these areas in the spring of 1940. And I said to Wayne earlier, hey, that was when Saturn and Pluto were squaring exactly, whereas when the war started in September of 1939, Saturn was in Taurus and Pluto was in Leo, but they just missed making an exact square. And they had to wait. I mean, basically, in the sky, that square, which is pretty tough, happened in March of 1940. Suddenly, that phony war that you talked about became active. But it wasn't immediately Adolf Hitler and the Luftwaffe flying over Great Britain. That was in September, and in the fall, the Battle of Britain. What Hitler did was he suddenly tuned in, and he was basically tuning into almost America's Mars IC line. He goes and attacks Norway. He attacks the Low Countries like Holland and the areas of Denmark and so on to get access up in that area. And then he goes into France. Well, so this line of energy that you just brought up, of course, the line through Germany. But one other thing, Wayne, that was amazing when you said Tunisia and Nigeria. Okay, get this. Because I've done all the Star Wars research on George Lucas. It's all in my podcast from a couple of years ago. In Welcome to Planet Earth, I studied Luke Skywalker, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Alec Guinness. I just watched The Bridge Over the River Kwai. I told you about that, I think, the other day. From 1957, won the Academy Award, 7 awards. And Obi-Wan Kenobi was Alec Guinness. Well, guess where they filmed the Star Wars? In Tunisia. So even the whole thing of Star Wars, the Force being with you, galactic battles, the whole idea of Mars is in Tunisia. And the other thing about Nigeria, because you just mentioned Nigeria, that's where they just have had a very unusual Ebola outbreak that I was reading about in the last couple of days. This is not the terrible Ebola, which I've actually studied when the first case came out in 1976. I did a whole report. I think it's still in Earth Clears News. But now, you know, in the midst of everything else, with all these different stories about COVID, about politics in this country, the Ukraine war, what just happened in South Korea, all these different stories, every place you just mentioned, right, is active in some kind of way internationally and also right now, and in terms of even Star Wars entertainment.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, what Wayne is bringing up, this is just one planet here. Now, of course, we could go, how many episodes would we need to do? The 8 planets, the sun and the moon, God forbid we throw in Sirius,
yes.
Athena, Juno, Vesta, and Chiron. We'll have, 16 episodes? Each lasting 2 hours? I mean...
And we basically did that little exercise the other day when we were talking about the U.S. moon lines and how they connect up to all of the test sites for not just the United States, but for the United States allies, and it's just profound. The British setting off their first atomic bomb on their U.S. moon line, the French setting off their first bomb in somebody else's country under the U.S.
Algeria,
moon line. Yeah, and so when we look at this tool, again, the map is not the territory. You have to bring something to the tool, and all of the background and all of the skill set that Mark brings helps us to go with it and flow with it and walk through the door and make the connections. And it's like juggling. I'm a juggler as a Gemini, but this is juggling all the balls in the universe. Sometimes it feels like, which is exhausting. But this, I want to just finish with this Mars line that runs through Germany and how profound it is. King George III, who was the reason for the Declaration of Independence, and when you read the Declaration of Independence, there's like 26 reasons why the colonials wanted to leave the control of George III. And George III had holdings in what is today unified Germany. But back then, it wasn't Germany. It was Prussia, and it was Hanover, and it was Bavaria, and it was all of these different. After the breakup of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, these nation states and these territories were beginning to coalesce and form different identities. But when George III was born, laying in his cradle, which has carved on the headboard "Ich bin," which is a German expression that says "I serve," D-I-E-N. Where did that come from? Well, that came from the fact that he was also, besides being the King of England and whatever of Scotland and whatever of Wales and whatever of Ireland, he was also this whatever of Germany. And he could command mercenary soldiers out of Germany, which is why we ended up with Hessian soldiers, 20,000 of them, being shipped over to invade the United States and land in Mark's hometown, New York. Invade
New York? Wait, New York.
The invasion of Staten Island. And
right.
And literally, as the Declaration of Independence was coming off the press, that armada of British foreign troops was crossing the Atlantic. And where was it crossing? It was crossing down the U.S. Mars descendant line. Now, remember, the Declaration of Independence was just being born, and this line was meaningful. But I find that to be the case in all the astro relocation, is that there's all this process that leads to a birth. There's a gestation of a baby. There's 9 months, 18 months if you're an elephant. So there's all this process that's this beforehand, and there's roots like ancestry. There's all this stuff. So you really can't make hard slices to separate this thing from that thing. They all connect together, as we are showing by bouncing around in this conversation. But Germany has long had a very deep, ingrained relationship with the former 13 colonies becoming the United States of America. In fact, the largest ethnic group in the United States to this day is people who claimed German heritage. That's the 2020 census. 16% of the country claims German heritage. That's the largest minority group.
Yeah,
and so
we have to the most popular foods aside from pizza are hamburgers and frankfurters.
Frankfurters. Yeah, well, who calls them frankfurters? Well, if you get the Hebrew nation, they call them frankfurters.
By the way, if you don't mind, I want to interject something, and
no, go with it.
Yeah, we're about an hour and a half, but the thing is, what I'm going to do is, the first one we did was an hour and 20 minutes. The last one we did was 2 hours plus. So we're going to stop at 2 hours. I think we can put it all together within the next half hour. And even though that's a lot of listening, one of the podcasts that I did that I want people to actually listen to, again, I did back just before the election 2 years ago, called The Astrology of Mars Retrograde at the USA November 2020 elections. And guess what, folks? That was 3 hours. So sometimes doing an hour, 2 hours, for me is short. And Wayne could tell you other stories about that. By the way, this podcast is called The Astrology of Mars Retrograde on October 30th of 2022 and Mars going direct on January 12th, 2023. For when you go to Astroscope, Mark Lerner Astrology Radio at GreatBearEnterprise.com, you'll be able to listen here and see the charts, because the only way you can see these charts that we're talking about, Mars going retrograde, stationary, Sun-Mars opposition, Mars going direct January 12th, and the full moon of Sagittarius-Gemini in the U.S. chart, the only way you can see the charts is to open the folder and see the beautiful color charts that we're doing so that you can say, aha, they're talking about Mars. Wayne is particularly giving an educational tour about Mars at the 4 main points of a chart. what I wanted to just bring up just very briefly, because you brought up the heart of Germany, and I don't like talking about this subject in general, but, you know, one of the specialties is about war, particularly for both Wayne. He's written the book on it, and I've just grown up with the whole thing, watching how Germany, America, Japan, Italy, France, United Kingdom. So what's interesting is on July 20th of 1944 was what was called Operation Valkyrie. And the reason I'm bringing this up is there was an annular solar eclipse on that day. And eclipses and new moons and full moons have this metonic cycle of every 19 years. And I'll get to this in a moment, because we've mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and then you mentioned George Bush Sr. as the sun in Gemini. And the first Gemini president we ever had was John F. Kennedy, whose sun was on our Uranus, which is where Mars is going to wind up stationary in January, which is why Wayne and I and many other astrologers are looking at this Mars cycle and saying, look, we need a lot of peace. We need a lot of love. We just had a Sun-Venus conjunction. I wrote the book Mysteries of Venus a while back, which had a print run of 2,000. There were no more copies. But I am doing Astrology in 5 on my app with 5-minute, believe it or not, 5-minute podcast reading from my book about Venus. Here we are talking about Mars. And Mars doesn't often go retrograde, but it is traditionally a planet of warriors and soldiers and athletics and agriculture and individual power, and can be used for good or for ill. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is Wolf's Lair. This was the place, that, and it was a miracle, a negative miracle in my understanding, that Adolf Hitler was not, this whole plot to kill Hitler. And there's the movie that Tom Cruise, starred in, Operation, or Valkyrie, I think it was just called Valkyrie, but the operation to try and get rid of Hitler was called Operation Valkyrie. The point is, it happened on July 20th of 1944, and it failed. But on July 20th of 1944, there was an annular solar eclipse at 27 plus degrees of Cancer, which Wayne knows is the opposition point to Pluto in the United States chart. And Pluto, like Mars, they're both connected to Scorpio, to will and power and all kinds of mysteries relating particularly to Scorpio. And then 19 years later, and this is a much longer story, but Wayne and I have talked about it, 19 years later, exactly to the day, when John F. Kennedy is president. So you go 19 years from July 20th of 1944, you get July 20th of 1963. And then the annular solar eclipse that happened at Operation Valkyrie that failed, even though it made Hitler into a wounded individual. We know that. We've seen all these films. We know it affected him. And that bombing in the Wolf's Lair in the heart of Germany. He even had Mussolini visiting that day. I think, Wayne, you know that as well. Hitler didn't stop the meeting, and he actually showed him the building and all these different things. There are newsreels, showing Hitler coming out wounded and so on, like, hey, it's a miracle I survived, and so on. Of course, he didn't realize what was going to happen, the rest of the war. So the final thing is, we're talking astrology. We're talking solar alignments. Wayne has brought up Mars, but also brought up in particular the sun and the moon. And you can't get anything more profound than an annular or total solar eclipse when the sun and moon are together. And that's what happened on July 20th of 1963. And it's at exactly the planet Saturn, it turns out, in JFK's chart at the midheaven. And this is when, as Wayne and I have shared many times, and other astrologers know, Jean Dixon, a famous psychic and astrologer, who had written in Parade magazine years before, she had written, and this is documented, she talked about somebody rising to power, a Democrat who would win the White House, who was in Parade magazine. This is when John F. Kennedy almost got on the ticket with Stevenson. Instead, it was Estes Kefauver. JFK gave a big speech in 1956. It made him a national figure. Then he wins the presidency over Nixon, becomes president, goes through his whole thing. We're not going to get into that now, maybe another time. But in that summer of July 20th of 1963 is also when the first nuclear test ban treaty in the air, Gemini, the president was a sun in Gemini. It actually takes place in Moscow, where the Secretary of State, I believe, Dean Rusk, signs for the United States. It happens in Moscow, so that both the United Kingdom, or all three, the United Kingdom, America, and Russia, that triangle, we all agree no longer going to explode nuclear weapons. France doesn't sign up. The Chinese have not yet gotten nuclear weapons. India, Pakistan, Israel, I don't think, none of these countries, the other ones who are nuclear powers, they're not part of it. But this is the crowning glory, shall we say, the positive thing of what JFK is able to give all of us, aside from going to the moon and other things. And then Gene Dixon calls the White House and says, I see the flag at half-mast. You can go on about that if you want, about the U.S. chart. And then nobody picks up on the warning. We get to November 22nd, and then JFK is slain in Dallas on November 22nd when Chiron's not moving. But the point is, a psychic and astrologer who was well-known tried to get through to the White House. She had a vision. This is also connected to the U.S. chart and the fact that there was a total solar eclipse on the president's Saturn at the top of his chart. We're talking about Mars. What Wayne is bringing up, Mars going through the Pacific. This is like one of the most volatile areas for the United States, both positive and negative. And here we have this other example. So I've shared my little spiel here, and back to you.
Okay, since you just mentioned that, and the positive and the negative, Mark's correct. We need to constantly state our position and whether or not we are hinting or implying. We can't be coy about how we are languaging up these symbols. A symbol is like a spectrum. It can mean many different things along a spectrum that range from the very, very horrible to the very, very wonderful. And so, for example, if you go back to the United States Mars midheaven line that is running off of American Samoa, that is the place where the Apollo mission returning from the moon splashed down. So that would be seen as a huge positive. And that spot...
That was the first one with Neil Armstrong, Armstrong?
Yes, that was, the moon landing.
Okay.
In July of 1969. And so when you look at the fact that TV cameras, hundreds of...
I have to interrupt you. Fly in the Family Stone, 1969, I want to take you higher.
There you go. And it was shortly after that I was just matriculating into Dartmouth, and that's when I saw Fly in the Family Stone. Well, it seems like it has no connection, but there you go. I want to take you higher.
Absolutely connected.
So Mark, here's the moon, here's the splashdown, and here are all the reporters with their TV cameras live broadcasting to the world. That spot in the Pacific Ocean under the U.S. Mars.
So significant because, again, we're talking now Mars in Gemini for 76 days, going retrograde. But guess what? After Mars, I should have pointed this out. I mean, I guess it's, Mars after it stops. It's 76 days from October 30th to January 12th. But Mars is already in Gemini. And it won't come out of Gemini until March. And the other thing, the elephant in the room, is it's out of bounds. It's too far north beyond where the sun goes to 23 degrees north in the system called declinations and parallels. And that's happening over a whole long period of time. And we've shared about that before, particularly the last two times, about declinations and sports and, football fields and people going off, the sidelines by inches and so on and things like that. And we will get back to that,
Let me grab that from you.
Episodes. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me segue off of that, Mark. And so here's my concern is with the following, the last line, the last of the angular lines. We've covered the Mars midheaven. We've covered the Mars descendant, which through Haiti and, open enemies and concerns with your relationships with these people in these nations that a former president called a shithole nation, and and the fact that they had that tremendous horrible earthquake and the earthquake relief, and the fact that our presidents went down there, former presidents, to do aid. Well, And then this Mars at the midnight zone that's running through the heart of Western Europe, where we've had 2 world wars. But we've also had the Marshall Plan. We've also had the revitalization of the German and the reunification of Germany becoming one of the most powerful economic nations in the world. So, you know, when you look at the pros and the cons of what you're getting under these lines, from the American perspective, remember, this is the U.S. horoscope that's been converted into a derivative map that is permanent for the life of the country. Now, we'd like the country to be around for a long time. We've been around for 245 years, but that's an infant compared to England, compared to these ancient cultures, compared to China. Okay? And so my concern is that 4th and final Mars line for the United States, because it is the ascending line. It's where the United States is doing first house kinds of things, like maybe acting recklessly, maybe initiating things, maybe being too forceful, or heavy-handed. All of these ways of putting language on it come to mind when I look at the fact that the United States during World War II had its major submarine pens in Perth, Australia, Australia, which is on the western coast. It's the biggest city in Australia.
I'm looking at it, just so you know, I'm visual. I brought it up on my computer screen, so I'm with you 100%.
And so when you're looking at Perth, next to Perth is this submarine pen called Fremantle. Free, F-R-E-E, Mantle, M-A-N-T-L-E. And that's where the United States, the Australian, and the British had their submarines berthed. And these submarines would go out into the waters of the Western Pacific, and they would destroy the merchant marine vessels of the Japanese. That's why the Japanese eventually ran out of the ability to fight the Americans. They couldn't resupply their bases.
I just clicked on the map, which is fascinating in this Sirius program. This is amazing because we've never done this before. I clicked on Perth for the U.S. relocation chart, and it gives me this information, and it says, orb, 0 degrees, 4 minutes, ascendant conjunct Mars. Now, everybody think about this, because all of you have a Mars rising somewhere. All of you have a Mars setting. All of you have a Mars at the top and the bottom. So this is what Wayne is bringing up. Here's what it says for the United States in Perth and Fremantle. Get this. I'm quoting directly, Wayne, and to all of you. You are aggressive and active in this area, period. You tend to work hard here, but you may find it difficult to relax. That's the personal description out of this interactive astromap interpretation. You go ahead. I'm just giving an example of actually clicking on a map to see these different points. Go ahead.
Okay. If you continue north, you go through the area in the upper island of Sumatra, where that horrible Christmas tsunami, Aceh, wiped out an entire community, and United States ex-presidents Clinton and I believe it was Herbert Walker Bush. I believe it was Herbert Walker. I don't think it was G.W. Bush. Went there hand in hand to support the relief effort. And the United States was definitely involved because the United States sent part of their 7th Fleet in order to help these people out. So that's a positive. You see, there's where you need quick, decisive movement, lots of power. You need to bring the earth movers in. You need to bring the food relief, and you need to show up yesterday. And so the United States did. Now, if you continue following that line up and go back to World War II, it goes through the Calcutta region of India. In other words, the extreme north eastern portion of India that goes into Bangladesh. And Bangladesh.
Okay. I'm going to pause. I have to add something to this one thing.
Go ahead, please.
This will only take me 20 seconds. I just clicked on that spot, could see where the line was going near Calcutta, which used to be East Pakistan. So when India and Pakistan went through their separation because they left the British August 15, 1947, part of the whole situation was on one area you had what we call Pakistan, the other area is called East Pakistan. Now that's Bangladesh.
Yes.
The reason I'm bringing this up is that is the Mars line, rising. But guess what? As I shared with Wayne earlier today, the asteroid Ceres, the largest asteroid, which is the only stationary body in the U.S. chart, is at 8 plus of Pisces. And that asteroid, which is a big part of the whole idea of what America's all about, the melting pot coming all together, Ceres is where a planet should have been or was a long time ago and got destroyed. Hence, we've got all these thousands of asteroids. It's part of the whole story of Star Wars, Alderaan in the first movie being obliterated by the Death Star. And everything I've investigated about George Lucas and so on, there's 3 podcasts on all this back in the Astroscope section. The midhaven, or the IC, the midhaven, the MC line, or the point directly above, is the United States Ceres in this part of the world as Mars is rising. But remember the whole thing with George Harrison, right? The concert for Bangladesh?
Yep.
There are still little children who are, if I've read about this, you don't hear about it, we've got all this ridiculous news, little kids who are being forced, like in the old days, they talk about kids being sent into the salt mines or having to work for pennies a day. Talk about that. That's still happening. So we got the U.S. Mars is rising. Ceres, the largest asteroid, not moving, is at the midhaven. That's a vertical line that's running through that whole area of the world, including the spot. Go ahead.
Okay, so the United States has mixed reviews in this part of the world, but during World War II, the theater, they called these different places in the world where armies were fighting theaters, and the Indochina theater was where the United States sent the Special Forces units, and one of these units was called Merrill's Marauders. Mm-hmm. Merrill's Marauders. Now, if you are a baby boomer, you probably remember the movies that came out in the 60s. I can't remember, the details about the movie, but I first learned about Merrill's Marauders in a movie, and it was about American Special Forces units who went behind enemy lines in Burma. It was called Burma then, not Myanmar. And they went behind the Japanese lines to destroy, harass, and to open up the Burma Road so that the United States could resupply China. Mm-hmm. And they had to go over a series of mountains called what was called the Hump. And at the same time that the Burma Tigers, that the Merrill's Marauders were operating, there was a fleet of planes called the Burma Tigers.
Okay.
And these were, before the United States sanctioned them, these were American pilots who volunteered to fly these missions over the mountains and bring supplies into Chiang Kai-shek's China. Now, that's the U.S. Mars zone. After that, there was a campaign after Merrill's Marauders were disbanded. A new special unit was put in, and it was called Operation Mars. Now, Mark and I are just fascinated by the names that the military commanders give to their, Overlord, Operation Overlord, Operation Barbarossa, Operation
Uranus, when Joe Biden was born, like 12 days before the nuclear axis and the first nuclear chain reaction in Chicago, which is another source of worry and concern. Go ahead.
There you go. And so Merrill's Marauders, they were our guys. They were our special forces. It was like if you're English, James Bond is your hero. But maybe in the countries that he goes and operates in, and the people he's beating up and shooting up, he's not. But the whole point is this is from the American perspective, how we purport ourselves in other nations where our lines run. And I think Mark, I'll give you this, and then you can take this to town. As recent as April 6, 1971, the United States State Department, a diplomat from stationed in India in the Foreign Service, wrote a telegraph, and it was called the Blood Telegraph. It's very famous. Mm-hmm. And it was, our government has failed to denounce the suppression of democracy. Our government has failed to denounce atrocities. Our government has failed to take forceful measures to protect its citizens while at the same time bending over backwards to placate the West Pakistan-dominated government and to lessen any deservedly negative international public relations impact against them. Our government has evidenced that what many will consider moral bankruptcy. We have chosen not to intervene, even morally, on the grounds that the conflict in which, unfortunately, the overworked term genocide is applicable is purely an international matter of a sovereign state. This was sent to Henry Kissinger and Nixon by a guy named Blood. That's why it's called the Blood Telegraph. So we have our people under these lines. They're the ground, they're the earth harvest. They're the ones who are scripted to play the role on these stages. And so, here's a person trying to do the right thing. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Well, I just, for balance here, because we're nearing 2 hours, and I do want us to sort of tie it together. And folks, Mars is going to be doing this for a while. I have no doubt whatsoever. Wayne's schedule and mine and are simulating these things. We could do easily a half dozen of these things. We could do it every day, but we're not going to do that. But what I'm looking at the map again. Look, I never did this before. I brought up the fact that Venus was overhead at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This was always called like the jewel in the Pacific for us, right? Remember that was kind of a term, particularly. It was so horrifying of what happened at Pearl Harbor. The fact that Venus and Jupiter are conjunct in the United States chart in the sign of Cancer, which is the sense of home, that we were able to obtain those particular islands. Again, the Mars line is not on that line, as Wayne has said. It's where Midway is and so on. But if you go further east from there, you get, as I said before, the relocated U.S. chart and showing these vertical lines. So I just wanted to bring this up because Venus is the opposite principle, or the, a balance to Mars. And we just had Sun conjunct Venus. And folks, we still have Sun conjunct Venus now. It's separating, but still together. And here we are bringing this to your attention. I just wanted to point this out, that I think that the Japanese attacking us, and it's a very fascinating chart because it was a grand triangle from the side of the Japanese. The sun was in Sagittarius, Mars was in Aries, Chiron, discovered in 1977, the wounded healer, twilight zone, esoteric forces. They made a grand triangle in fire signs. And there were many other things on that date. And it did affect the midpoints, particularly the Mars-Uranus midpoint in the U.S. chart. The sun on that day, December 7th, was activating our anger and our volatility and our loss of life. However, when you listen to the impassioned speech of FDR, getting back to the two presidents, the two Roosevelts, the way he constructed that in a little more than 24 hours, right? He was looking at a stamp collection. He was into stamps. It's fascinating to look at that, like 24 plus hours. The crossing out of the words, knowing that Churchill, right? Earlier in 1940, we will fight them on the landing fields. We will fight them on the beaches. We will never surrender. You know what I mean? Can you imagine like this, being translated into the German and somebody saying, here's your guy over there, Winston, from World War I, Gallipoli, the Navy. and all of these other things we could talk about another time. At any rate, Franklin Roosevelt, we have to defend the jewel in the Pacific. We just lost thousands of lives. The Japanese, and again, you have one of their leaders who's asked, what do you think is going to happen? He says, I'm afraid we've wakened a sleeping tiger. The other part of this thing is I'm looking here. The reason I'm bringing this up is that's where Venus and Jupiter are overhead. And I know you know these things. Okay, I'm just sharing with the public. The Venus-Jupiter at the bottom of the chart is going through Cape Town, South Africa.
Yes, it is.
Apartheid.
Yes, it is.
And going up through the heart of, it's going through Tripoli, and it's going through Western Egypt. We can get into these other countries another time. We can talk about Venus and Jupiter. They're the traditional benefics.
Yes.
And Venus particularly. One other thing, they're also going through Europe. But I want to bring up one other point, is that suddenly I'm looking at the Venus-Jupiter line. I realize, folks, we can't do all this. And there's one other line I want to mention, that's where Venus and Jupiter are rising in Vietnam, for God's sakes. And if we
that's correct.
How
about Hong Kong? Yep.
What we have to do, and what Wayne is so fantastic at doing, is what is America? We are the world's policemen. And even the other day, somebody wrote an article, and they said this, that with Joe Biden, I'm not against Joe Biden. He's Sun Venus conjunction. There's a whole history there of who he is and so on. But somebody mentioned in an article, I forget exactly what it was, that a communication was sent, and I forget who said this, to the leader of the free world. It was an article, I think, of the Atlantic magazine, and they wrote this, and they said, a message was just sent to the leader of the free world. And then the first line was, I'm not talking Joe Biden. I'm talking Vladimir Zelensky. And the fact that in the middle of that whole world, we have this Churchillian figure who, oddly enough, has Jewish heritage in Ukraine. Now, this will be another time. But Venus and Jupiter are rising. And Wayne has just given you a master class in Mars's locations and so on. And I'm just trying to sort of open the door to balance it out and say another time we'll look at Venus, Jupiter. But I want to mention one other thing, because this is something Wayne knows unbelievably, but we have never done this where I'm looking at the map. I'm literally looking at the yellow and the red lines that you can see in the lead in GPS astrology to Wayne's stories, so that you can start mastering this. And maybe you want to get into, where are my lines? I want to order it. We have 5 different reports. You can check my astrology reports here. This is not really to sell stuff. I just want people to know, hey, 5 reports, different cities in the world. You can read about it. You get relocation charts. So one other thing, which I know could set us off, but, we're going to have to sort of pull it together, and I'd like your closing statements. I'm looking at the Uranus rising line, which is also going through parts of India, and I'm clicking on Kabul, where we see that, and you know this better than anybody, which will be another topic. Kabul, the United States Uranus at 7+ Gemini, which is JFK's sun, is rising in Kabul, Afghanistan. So look at that whole history. And I see also 35 north is Kabul, which you've studied. It's on the front of your book. Is it not, Kabul, right?
Exactly.
One of the places as a key latitude line having to do with Wayne's state of Params. I just want to read this one line. Remember, I read earlier, ascendant conjunct Mars for Perth and Fremantle, and the area of Bangladesh, or ascendant conjunct Uranus. If you think about this, folks, in terms of symbols of Mars, of what we just went through pulling out of Afghanistan, the whole thing with Osama bin Laden, the Russians being there for 10 years, from 1979 to 1989, they pull out. Eventually, we wind up going in there for 20 years. The tragedies, the loss of life.
The longest war in U.S. history.
Okay, and here's this little thing. Now, this is obviously written for a person, but the computer doesn't know that. It's saying Astro-Locality Report for not a person, for USA, born July 4th, 1776, 4:49 in the afternoon, Philadelphia. Selected point, 35 north, 69 east, 7+ Gemini rising, 17+ Aquarius at the midhaven. And it says ascending conjunct Uranus. There's a 1-degree orb, but that's hardly anything. And here's the quote. if you were a person, but this is for a country, for the United States, if our leaders could have only read this a long time ago, right? Here's what it says. Surprises and unexpected changes occur here, period. Plans are not likely to turn out as expected, period. People think you are unusual or strange. I mean, this is as an Islamic country that defeated the Russians and basically defeated us, more or less. People think you, meaning America, are unusual or strange. And you are in a mood to experiment and try different things. So when you think about dream language and the use of words, and Wayne and I always talk about facts and history and philosophy and nuclear things, atomic structure, these words are amazing. This is just for one particular program. And if you take, the fact that a program in just 3 sentences could explain why America should have never sort of gotten there in the first place, right? And it's
Mark,
exactly it.
Let me take you somewhere very close to where you're looking right now. If you could look at Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Now, what you just read would apply to Samarkand also, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, I took the Wave map. I'm putting it back. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm bringing that up is that's where the great big summit between Putin and Iran and China occurred, where where pushed back on the notion of India. India was there too. Pushed back on
Modi was there, the prime minister. Right.
Yeah. And so all of these people are collecting together on this stage for the United States with Uranus in Gemini, and recently the Mars transit in Gemini. This long series of transits where it's going to retrograde and return back to the Uranus position, and you've given those dates.
Yeah.
And so what alarmed me is here the United States in this region of the world has action-oriented planets, first house planets. And what's important is what those different stages mean and where they're going through. Now, Samarkand, of course, national security. If I were still in the military, we'd have our spies and our listening instruments and our satellites and everything tuning in on their 3-4 day, week-long conference. But what is most concerning for me is that the Baikonur, which is the launch site for the Soviet space program, resupplying and sending astronauts up to the International Space Station, is right between those two lines. It's a Gemini relocation. In fact, when you look, you find that the United States relocated to Baikonur is 15 Gemini on the ascendant. And then when you go up further into Russia, headed in the direction of the Western European parts of Russia, okay, you run into all of the defense plants for the former Soviet Union, now servicing the Russian. Are they a federation? They're a federation. And that is concerning for me because, when we hear about them testing their hypersonic missiles, we hear about them breaking out a new this or that has to do with the war effort. And we hear their president, Putin, bragging about these things. That's where they're coming from. They're coming in from the midst of the United States, Uranus, and Mars ascendant lines.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that's all I wanted to say.
Because of the significance, this is how Wayne and I do things. When you go to Astroscope on Great Bear Enterprises, this is again called the Astrology of Mars Retrograde, on October 30th, just to repeat that so you know what you're going to look for, October 30th, 2022, and if we can add this part, and Mars going direct on January 12th, 2023. So that's the podcast. I'm going to let us continue, even though it's longer. Hey, at least it's recorded. If you don't want to keep listening, then the way I often talk about it, if I go 3 hours on a podcast, which has only happened like 3 times, I joke around and I say, well, now you're on a flight to Hawaii, which oddly enough is now what we're doing, literally by going to Pearl Harbor, going to Midway. Whereas if you're listening to one of my earlier podcasts done 3.5 years ago, and this is true, and I'm not exaggerating, I actually did a 45-minute podcast on the United States Progress Sun and Progress Palace. I was into all these U.S. progressions. By the way, that's other stuff you can get at Great Bear Enterprise in the Astrology Report area. We've got all these progressions, skylog reports, timeline reports, specialties. So please look that up. What I want to tell you, though, is because, see, this is Wayne sort of lives and breathes this stuff. I do it with the global hotspot. Every new moon and full moon, I'll put out the map. So I'm going to add this map, the U.S. map. I'm going to put this into the folder, okay? My daughter does all this stuff, Katya. She's the one who's leading us with GPS astrology. She's a whiz kid with all this stuff. So I'm going to say, hey, we need 4 charts, the U.S. chart, all color in the folder, and please put the U.S. map, how all of our lines. So get this, and Wayne knows this exactly when I start talking. The other side of the Uranus rising line, this yellow line that goes through Kabul in this area of Samarkand and so on, where the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and other of their alliances met, is New York. If you read New York, okay, Uranus is setting in that chart, okay, because natally in the U.S. chart we have Mars in the 7th house, but once Uranus was discovered 5 years after the war started, March 13, 1781, and this is for another topic of where it was in the discovery chart. Wayne and I deal a lot with discovery of all the planets. It's really fascinating. But the point is Uranus was almost exactly setting anyway. Okay, in other words, Uranus was within 1 degree of the setting point of the U.S. chart. So on the map, when you look at it, folks, we've been talking about the area where Uranus is rising in that part of the world, Perth, Fremantle, right, which is what Wayne is describing. Then you start going up, and this is all where Uranus is incredibly powerful because the U.S. has it as a rising position, which we've been talking about. However, the setting position can be just as intense. So I'm reading 40 North 22, which is the latitude of New York City, where I'm from, 74 West. Again, Astro-Locality Report for USA, July 4th, 1776, 4:47 in the afternoon, Philadelphia. And the first line is descendant conjunct Uranus. Why am I bringing this up? Because Osama bin Laden went to Afghanistan the whole history of his life, because he got inspired because the Afghanis were fighting the Russians. And Afghanistan is an Islamic country, and he wasn't fighting the Russians, they were fighting the Soviets, who are not religious, at least in terms of Soviet Union. And they won in 10 years. And then we wound up eventually doing all this rigmarole and winding up fighting 20 years in that part of the world. And it's during that time that Osama bin Laden goes on and hiding all over the place. We eventually find him in Pakistan. But if you remember, folks, the first reports is that he's hiding in Afghanistan, which is why that war begins. We got to get, that happened. Then there's the whole thing with Saddam Hussein and all that terrorism. But the point is, he does take credit for 9/11 with all these different interviews that happen later on. There's a CNN guy goes in there. There's all this whispering. There's all these recordings about what happened, how it happened, getting the planes and all that stuff. The point is, the planet Uranus for the United States, shocks and surprises, let alone radioactivity, all kinds of things. We've got the rising line over going through Kabul, and then the setting line is permanently for the United States, not just Philadelphia and Washington, but New York City, where 9/11 particularly happens. And it says the following: descendant conjunct Uranus for the United States relocated to New York City. It's not a far move from Philadelphia, but it says relationships with others are likely to take unexpected turns while you are in this area. Desire for excitement in relationships is strong and commitment tends to be weak, resulting in sudden changes. The orb is like half a degree. And that's the first line of what America experiences in New York, which is the mirror image of our line going through Kabul. So Mars, Uranus, Sun, Venus, Jupiter. Eventually we'll get to a whole bunch of things because, Neptune, Pluto, that would be several episodes. Right, Wayne?
That'll be several episodes exactly. This by nature, like all things that people master and spend a lifetime doing, have its challenges and require. The one thing I think the biggest requirement, Mark, is the openness, because when you and I brought our two different styles together, it opened up an entirely different door.
Yeah.
We have played off of one another. We've used each other's sounding boards. I can say something, and then all of a sudden you can holler over from your perspective and light your bonfire on what you see, and then I can go and in my own way and in my own style respond to it. And I think that's what I love about groups that get together and do brain trust or do that kind of work together. As long as it works like that, as long as there's that kind of the key word is freedom to be yourself, and then but again, the whole is the sum of the parts. The whole is the sum of the parts, but the parts don't own the whole.
Right.
And so, we can use these tools. Each one of us, and you, the audience listening, we can use the tools that we have that unlock ourselves to ourselves, and that give us a greater insight, a deeper understanding to the cultures and the nations that we live in. Because what we're getting in the mainstream is by necessity filtered. Not everybody understands things at the same level. And my father, who was a captain in the Army, he used to say that when you're training men, you have to break it down so that the least capable amongst them is able to master the skill. And so guys are taught to disassemble their rifles blindfolded. And the rifle is made out of simple parts. The butt, the stock of a M16 weapon or an AR, whatever they call them these days, 15, is made by a toy company. Mattel Toy Company makes those. Now, can you imagine a weapon of war and the stock and the hand grips are made by a toy company?
Unfortunately, I can't imagine that, but go ahead.
No, there's not much more to say on that. It's just totally.
Well, it brings up the whole. This is another thing, folks, for like 3 more episodes. The connection between video games, particularly young Americans at home, right?
Yeah.
The amount of money and all that, electronic arts and so on. Look, when Wayne and I were younger, I remember when I got out to Eugene in my 30s, 2 little kids, we got the Atari thing. We got those little, at that point, remember everybody who was older, remember Pac-Man? Like that.
Yeah, I remember Pac-Man.
And now we have this sophisticated universe where part of it, bless his soul, George Lucas became so successful with the Star Wars franchise that he started doing all those video games, and people couldn't get enough of it, particularly young guys. So we have not only the war, right, all these different wars, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and so on, Iraq, Iran, the U.S. as world's policeman. Meanwhile, on the home front, we've got this other volatility, and this is all related to Mars and Uranus and Neptune and Pluto with what Wayne is sharing, particularly with his book, War Impulse Pattern and so on. That star is not on the map, where he's showing on the cover the latitude lines, particularly around like 33 to 35 north. You start seeing him line up all these places, and you say, well, what is he talking about? What he's talking about is what we're talking about today. I mean, to some extent, that's more sophisticated because they're like these Paran lines. In other words, there's latitude, there's longitude. What we're doing is almost the simplest thing. Hey, let's just relocate the circular chart of the United States.
Exactly.
And because Mars is not moving and it's incredibly powerful, and we all need to be, hopefully, fingers crossed, as loving and peaceful and calm, even though we get excited. Well, that's okay. You know, we're passionate about what we're doing. That's a positive energy. Once in a while, you know, we call each other brothers. I grew up, I didn't have a brother. Wayne has brothers. You know, I'm always looking and have always looked for brotherly support. Well, male energies, you know, female energies, particularly when Wayne's expertise is about the war energies of the tradition of Mars. But look, part of the thing is what I worry about. I think we need to bring up some closing statements. So let me bring up one closing statement for me. One of the things that I keep watching in these documentaries, this is what worries me. The Great Depression is happening. Okay, this is in a nutshell, folks. You go back to Franklin Roosevelt taking over. I was just studying the time period 1931, 1932, for various reasons. Gorbachev, who just passed away, you know, was born in 1931 in March. Yeltsin, who, you know, was also a leader after Gorbachev of Russia after the Soviet Union fell, was born a month earlier. They're like twin guys, February and March. A month apart, 1931. What are the odds that would be happening? And then in America, we get Franklin Roosevelt taking over against Hoover, who had won in a landslide in 1928 over Al Smith, the first Catholic nominee. He never made it. Now we have the second Catholic president. JFK was Catholic, and now we have Joe Biden in terms of religion. But what I'm worried about is there were a lot of rumors about the Depression in the United States and FDR as president, right, that somehow we needed to go to war. And we know that, as you said, Wayne, with Lend-Lease and everything else, there were different rules that we had. We couldn't just give a lot of, you know, material battles unless we declared war. I mean, I guess we could have, you know, and in a way we did stealthy things, but Lend-Lease was one way so that Germany wouldn't declare war on the United States for sending the stuff. So they wanted to be careful about it between Churchill and Roosevelt and so on. So they did these particular things. By the way, folks, the Atlantic Charter, which I have in one of my books, was January 6th. Talk about a date, 1941. Okay, the Atlantic Charter. So 80 years to the day after those principles between America and the United Kingdom. This is before we went to war. While the Battle of Britain, you know, had already started happening, that's when we had our insurrection at the Capitol building with all those horrors there, 80 years to the day from the Atlantic Charter. Okay. My concern is that what we see in Russia, what we see Putin doing is we have a lot of depressed economies. We have a lot of, you know, problems, you know, in terms of money and inflation, these whole other issues, the rise of cryptocurrencies, you know, people losing money, you know, the whole pandemic. And one of the ways out of that is to be involved in a war, you know what I mean, to go on to a war economy. And look what America did from the end of 41 to 1945 and becomes this colossal, right, coming back from the brink of disaster on Pearl Harbor to then drop 2 nuclear weapons or atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And even then, the Japanese don't surrender. They don't know what's happening until September 2nd. And you know this on the on the USS Missouri, oddly enough, and Harry Truman from Missouri is president of the United States. It doesn't stop things. We just keep having these other wars, cold wars and hot wars. So, you know, unfortunately, there's this kind of thing. Same thing with the Spanish-American War, bring back to Theodore Roosevelt, right? That's how he got his stripes as a young guy, as a Rough Rider. That's why he was put on the ticket. the Republican Party, when you go into it, they didn't want Theodore Roosevelt. He was too popular. You know what I mean? Remember the name. All of these things, which were part of yellow journalism and so on. We don't always get the truth, as Wayne and I we look at all these different facts and all these stories, and we have to sort out what's real, what isn't real. You know, that's why I love the almanac, and that's why we love astrology, because look, these charts that you're going to look at, we're not making it up. These are the exact moments from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. If somebody ever said, "Oh, you're making the chart up," you know, for the sun, tomorrow morning, 9:27 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time is the exact time according to our scientific results, or for when Mars is as stationary as it can be and then begins retrograde. So that's a birth moment. Or when the sun goes opposite Mars and it's retrograde, right after this anniversary of Pearl Harbor on December 8th, sun opposite Mars retrograde. There's an exact moment of time. By the way, folks, when you look at these charts, that's just for Washington, D.C. I mean, the zodiacal energies are similar, but the house positions, again, are going to change. What's up, what's down, what's rising, what's setting, all over the world, when you calculate these powerful charts and new moons, full moons, and eclipses, you have to choose a particular place as far as the house positions are concerned, the rising, setting, above, and below. But the zodiacal positions stay the same. Okay, so that's the end of what I want to say here. Why don't you put out what you want to share, and then we'll sort of be done for today.
Okay.
Tonight. Yeah.
When I travel and I plan my travel, I know where I'm going. I mean, there's a whole lot of knowledge involved in making a decision to leave your country and to go to another country. And so as an astrocartographer, or as a person with astrological awareness, I know what the relocation is going to be. I also know why I want to go to this place. I have an intention. And you can look at your intention, and you can look at one more thing, the ephemeris. What time is it? Is this a time when I'm getting intense transits to my horoscope and to that very planet that I want to travel to, whether it be across the United States or whether it be out of the United States to another country? So these are tools that you can develop some sophistication and use it, and some understanding of what the range is of the symbol that marks the place. So when I go, for example, to Istanbul, Turkey, to give a lecture, an astrological lecture, I'm going to my Uranus descending line. I have an audience that wants to hear astrological information, and Uranus is given rulership over astrologers. It's been a very fruitful relationship. I can go back to the pot many times and get lots of benefits and happiness out of returning to that stage. What I'm concerned about for the United States as an entity is that its ambassadors and its diplomats and its military people who are constantly on the move. The Secretary of State Blinken is everywhere, it seems. Right. Hillary Clinton booked more miles than any other Secretary of State up to that point. She owned the record. I think it was like 1 million miles, some outrageous number. Right. And so when they go to these stages as surrogates for the country, that they don't go to a Kabul without having some deeper knowledge. I mean, you certainly, I understand that there's top secret information and that there's stuff that the president receives in his daily briefing and that only certain people are party to it. But to go in and make rookie decisions. Yeah. So we're going to get some sports analogies here, Mark. We'll close with some sports analogies. You can't go out of bounds because there are some rules, and don't make rookie mistakes. What did you call it, Mark? An unforced foul.
An unforced error, yeah.
Unforced error. There you go. And so I'm going to end it on that. I hope that our country is not going to its Uranus ascendant line with Mars in Gemini retrograding all the way back to 8 degrees and to the United States Uranus position, and then going back and crossing its Mars position in that part of the world where earlier in the last couple of months we've heard count on many occasions Putin bragging about his new weapons and launching this missile and that missile and hypersonics and all of that, and nuclear testing and it's just crazy that we're sending rookies. You're gonna send your cleanup batter in there, isn't it? Right, your designated hitter.
Well, to interweave a little bit here, because I realize I do want to. There's a couple other things about podcasts, and just Brother Wayne and I are going to be doing. We decided a while back, and again, this may seem like we're all over the place, but for us, this is actually a concentrated kind of thing because, as you know from the last time, what did we do? 10 or 11 topics. We had a list of like 15. We only got to like 12, and that was 2 hours, right?
Yes.
But now, you see, what we're doing is we want to provide the chart. So again, for this particular one, even though it may seem like a lot of stuff, notice for all of you listening, we didn't go into a whole analysis of every planetary position tomorrow morning in the chart. We're trying to open the door. Look, a lot of you listening, you're astrologers, or for instance, I have 36 classes in the School of Planetary Studies. By the way, it's on an incredible discount. You can read about it in Great for Enterprise. You want to learn astrology, 36 one-hour classes that I started creating, back in the 1980s with a small group of students. They were on cassette tape. Remember those things? Then they were on CDs. Now it's MP3 files that you listen with your headset. And my daughter created this whole thing, lesson notes, charts. The first charts are John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe, not because they had an affair, but we knew their charts and they were larger than life. So, look, GPS astrology, which is a vision, it's the, capstone of my pyramid, having done Welcome to Planet Earth. Wayne and I were a part of that. Look, I published it. I was the editor-in-chief. But I feel that comradeship, I guess that's not a great word to use, but that sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, working together in an Aquarian group manner. That's a big part of my chart. It's also for Wayne. We both have strong Aquarius. And it was the thrill of my life to do that. For some reason, having been a Findhorn, Lucis Trust, same thing with Wayne, with where he's gone around the planet. The group dynamic is part of like what I learned, particularly with Lucis Trust, the Arcane School, being at Findhorn. What can we do in a group setting? When I went to Findhorn, the people there, Peter Caddy particularly, was like, what do we need this torpy Mark Lerner guy who knows astrology and bringing tarot? Okay, again, our Out of Bounds is not only appearing this time as a podcast 102 in Mark Lerner Astrology Radio Astroscope, where Wayne and I are doing this. It's also going to be on our YouTube channel, Mark Lerner Tarot and Astrology. So Out of Bounds is in both of these places, but also in GPS Astrology in the first 2 issues, because one can actually click on that when you read through it and start, jump from GPS Astrology to listening to Wayne and myself. The thing is that there's so much going on, and I just wanted to mention that in the other podcasts that I've done I've done like almost 100 of them. If you go through Astroscope, you'll see a kind of spectrum of what America and the world has gone through, which I started, let's say, in May of 2019. So that's what, three and a half years ago, to do 99 podcasts. Okay, so this is the 102nd. The last 2, one of my clients is a great friend. Her name is Christy Walsh. She interviewed me this summer about the moon and then on Uranus. And those are the last 2 podcasts. When you go to listen to Out of Bounds, this episode, 2 guys talking sports and astrology, this entire program of 2+ hours, there are going to be, 5 charts, including the U.S. chart, and a map, the U.S. map with all those colored lines, so you can follow what Wayne is sharing about, and which I've interrupted every so often to say, hey, what about this? What about that? Any more You just brought in sports again. Tomorrow will be another big day for America. I always keep my fingers crossed with Mars exactly, right? Tomorrow morning, like 9:27 Eastern Daylight Time. So it isn't just that Mars for that 1 minute of time. That's when we do the chart. But the thing is that Mars is not going to be moving anywhere for a couple of days. And that's the same thing that's going to happen on, that was my last thought, on January 12th, everyone. For a few days before and a few days after, or even a week before and after, Mars is just sitting at 8+ Gemini, which is the United States Uranus position. And that's going to ignite those lines that Wayne and I were sharing. Kabul, Fremantle, Perth, the eastern coast of the United States, New York City. And as Wayne said, Haiti suddenly says, hey, to the United Nations, we really need help. Well, that's America. We're a very Uranian country in terms of Uranus being discovered at the time of the success of the American Revolution. We'll get into that another time. A couple more closing points from you?
No.
What?
Well, look. I know you have a dog in this fight, and you didn't like that. Mr. Vic soured you on that phrase. But I am definitely going to be cheering for Philadelphia to beat
Houston Astros. Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's despite that we love Dusty Baker, and he's bringing to the sports world, I guess this will be my final point. I said to you earlier, the fact that he's wearing gloves, he's explaining because he's 73, he's of our generation, and he wears
a map.
He's setting a wonderful example of saying, hey, from the older generation, which is getting forgotten, look, part of the reason, we'll just end on this from me. We've seen this terrible tragedy in South Korea. South Korean government in the last few days said, guess what? No mask. Don't worry about it. Pandemic over. So all these people in South Korea, it's an enormously, Seoul, South Korea. They all gathered for a Halloween festival, which is basically, having read the whole Wikipedia thing on this, going back to Celtic area, Christian time periods, Saints Day, Souls Day, this kind of crazy time period, the end of October, early November, you get tens of thousands of people. We're doing this our Saturday night, but this event that just happened, they call it an incident, which I think is a terrible term when people are dying and so many tragedies. We have these euphemisms. An incident occurred, according to our press. Are you kidding me? How many times are we going to take a very, very difficult, life and death or death like situation or actual situation, and the way we do it, even though they'll show it on TV or whatever, they'll say, oh, this is really terrible, tell kids to look away. We call it an incident. This is common practice, left, right, center, up, down. We can't tell the truth about the reality of life and death and these struggles that Wayne and I are sharing with you about history and events in history. We brought up Hitler in this thing. I wish I didn't have to. We brought up Putin, who has a moon in Gemini. You know what I mean? He's not having the Mars energy. That's the other thing I should say. Wherever 26 to 9 of Gemini or 9 to 26 of Gemini is getting this overdose, whether it's in one of your 12 houses, whether you have planets there, that's what you want to start studying based on what we're talking about today. That part of your chart is getting activated in a super way. You want to be able to direct those energies as creatively and sensitively so it doesn't create anger and difficulty. I think I'm done.
I think you're done.
And so we will be back with episode 4, and this will also be in a couple of days on YouTube. It'll also eventually find its way elsewhere, but the first place it'll be is at Mark Lerner Astrology Radio, Astroscope, at www.greatbearenterprise.com. We look forward to doing more with you and just keep learning and just stay in touch with us. There's email addresses and everything. And look through GPS Astrology on that tab at Great Bear Enterprises. You can read each of the issues. You can see all of what Wayne is presenting, what I'm presenting, and all these other astrologers. So many blessings to all of you. Thank you very much, Wayne. And we'll just keep moving along here, right?
Right. A safe journey moving out of bounds.
Okay, great. Okay, love and blessings to you. Love and blessings to everybody. And we'll be back next time with Out of Bounds, two guys talking sports and astrology.